help prevent.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Hallie Jackson.
Good day. We're coming on the air with breaking news. President Biden's son, Hunter, spending the morning in a Delaware federal courthouse. He was there to enter a plea agreement over federal tax charges. It should have been fairly quick, fairly routine. It was not. Instead, after some tense moments, some apparent confusion, some back and forth with the prosecutor, the defense, and the judge, a plea deal has not been reached because of some concerns that the judge has. Instead, the president's son has entered a not guilty plea for now. This is the first time a sitting president's son has faced federal charges. They come after a 5-year investigation from the Justice Department, which resulted in 2 misdemeanor counts against Hunter Biden for failing to pay his taxes in both 2017 and 2018. Hunter Biden is also facing a separate felony gun possession charge that's expected to be dismissed if he meets certain conditions. However, outside of specific tax, drug, and gun charges, in this plea agreement, which again has not been finalized, it appears possible that Hunter Biden could still be charged with other crimes down the road. The prosecutors today made very clear this investigation is ongoing. This is a legal matter, of course, for the president's son, but it has become a political one, too, in a big and significant and potentially controversial way. Now, remember, these are federal charges. That means no cameras in court, but our Ryan Nobles was inside for all of this. And, Ryan, this was unexpected drama, no clear resolution as we speak, other than we are not reporting, right, that Hunter Biden entered this plea deal. It hasn't happened.
That's exactly right, Hallie. I mean, this was a stunning development by any measure. The president's son and his legal team had really hoped that today would mark the end of their legal troubles, that he would be able to move on with his life and in some respects allow his father, the president of the United States, to not have to deal with this political distraction. But it was exactly the opposite. Very early on in this proceeding, we could tell by the questions being asked by the federal judge in this case, Mary Ellen Niorca, that she was very concerned with the arrangement that had been worked out between prosecutors and Hunter Biden's legal team. It was 2 separate agreements, one that would allow Biden to plead guilty on 2 different tax charges for his failure to pay taxes in the years 2017 and 2018, and then separately that he would enter into a pretrial diversion program that would, over the course of 2 years, allow a pending gun charge, a charge that he was in possession of a firearm while using drugs, which is against the law, that pending charge would be dismissed if he successfully completes that diversion program. Well, the judge was concerned, A, that these 2 separate issues were being connected, even though at one point Hunter Biden said that he was willing to plead not guilty with the clear understanding that they were not connected, but also separately that it was the judge who would be in position to determine whether or not he was in violation of that diversion program. That is something that normally a federal judge is not responsible for. That's an agreement worked out with a prosecutor and a defendant in a case like this. Regardless, because she had all of these questions and because she felt that despite the fact that we were in that courtroom for almost 3 hours, I think a little more than 3 hours, that these both the attorneys for both the prosecutor and for the defendant were not able to answer the questions in a way that she felt were sufficient to make her feel comfortable, she decided that she needed to defer her decision on the plea agreement. Now, that meant that Hunter Biden then had to plead not guilty in this particular case so that they could continue to work out those issues. Now, there are still a lot of open questions that have yet to be resolved in this case, Hallie. At this point, they have not set a date where the prosecutors, the defendants, and the judge will come together once again to discuss the next stage of this plea arrangement. They're going to have to provide her with a lot of information to convince her that the parameters that they've outlined are appropriate. And then, as you rightly point out, what was revealed in court today in a great deal of specificity is that this agreement is for a very narrow window of time and specifically related just to these tax charges and these gun charges, and that there is still the possibility that the president's son is being investigated on a whole host of other issues or could potentially find himself on the wrong side of the law in many other aspects. So if there was any hope that this was going to be the end of these legal issues for Hunter Biden and by extension his father, that that it was all going to come to a close today, that certainly was not resolved in any way, shape, or form. Hallie?
And at this point, it's not even clear when it will get resolved, Ryan, because the timeline question is also still an open one. So to be crystal clear, so that folks understand this, and we're going to go to some of our legal experts in just a second here. Essentially, this plea agreement consisted of two buckets, let's call them, one on taxes and one on this gun charge. The judge's concern was on that second bucket. She has questions, so she's not approving this until she can better understand this. That is why Hunter Biden entered that not guilty plea, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the judge felt that constitutionally she should not be the one responsible to be the arbiter of whether or not Hunter Biden was abiding by the provisions that they outlined in this diversion program. And she said many times that normally when a diversion program is agreed to by the two sides, that a federal judge or a judge of any kind is not even made aware of that this is an agreement that the two sides work out and that the bench is not involved in it. This is a situation where, and Hunter Biden's lawyer admitted this in open court, that because of the political considerations surrounding this issue, because there's so much attention being paid to Hunter Biden and the accusations that the Department of Justice may have been giving him preferential treatment, that they wanted a third-party independent arbiter to make it clear if he was in violation of that diversion program, that it was somebody that didn't necessarily have a dog in the fight. She said she understood that, but she also said she didn't think that the Constitution allowed her that ability because of separation of powers. It's not the responsibility of the judicial branch to say it's time to move forward with a prosecution. That's the responsibility of the executive branch and the Attorney General's office. So that's why she was so concerned about this, and she just did not want Hunter Biden to agree to something that ultimately could come back to haunt him in the long run. She wanted to make sure that he was 100% comfortable with this idea of pleading guilty to these charges and understood everything that was involved in it.
Ryan, stand by for just a second. I want to bring in former U.S. Attorney and former senior FBI official Chuck Rosenberg, who is joining us now. So, Chuck, gut check here. How unusual is it for something like this to happen, for a proceeding like this?
Yeah, so plea hearings, Hallie, are utterly routine until they're not. That said, there was nothing routine about this particular case. I mean, put aside the fact that no child of any president had ever been prosecuted for a federal crime in federal court. This deal was more complex. As you aptly described, it had two separate buckets. They were linked in court. All federal judges go through a plea colloquy, a hearing, a discussion with a defendant to make sure that he or she understands all of the terms of the agreement. And the judge has to be satisfied that everything is in order. That didn't happen here. So I think in some ways the judge was right to call a timeout and to ask the parties to continue to speak to one another, to negotiate, so that if and when they come back before her with a second plea agreement, if you will, Hallie, everything will be in order. So it's an unusual case to begin with an unusual plea agreement and an unusual defendant, and a judge who was being very careful in exercising her duties to supervise the proceedings in court. A lot of interesting facets to this and much to discuss.
Well, let me bring in our NBC News legal analyst, Danny Savalos, to join this conversation for this discussion. Danny, what options may the judge have now moving forward, and what, in your view, and I realize this is tea leaf reading, seems to be among the likelier outcomes here?
I believe under the rules, the judge is required to set a preliminary hearing date now that there's been a not guilty plea. I'm not so sure if we'll see that pop up on the docket or if it's something that was addressed. But procedurally, that's really what happens next. In all likelihood, the parties will work something out in the next 2 weeks before that 21-day period. And another thing to point out is I think the judge was exactly right. When it comes to pretrial diversion, that is a creature of the prosecutor and the prosecutor alone. Really, the court's only role is delaying the case, hitting the pause button, and the defendant waives his speedy trial rights so that he can complete a program that is essentially run by the government, by the prosecutors. They alone decide if the defendant has violated. If he picks up a new arrest, for example, then the DA, or in this case the government, learns of it, and they bring the case back and they prosecute him with full force. So that is an understandable concern. The other thing that was always going to be a controversy is the defendant would would have expected that a plea would have been a global resolution of all potential charges. So I imagine they were surprised to learn that maybe the government contemplated additional charges. Normally, the plea agreement is supposed to handle that with its language, but sometimes there's a lot of litigation over whether language like everything pending in this indictment or this information includes everything being investigated at the present time. So it all comes down to the language, hammering out the agreement, making sure both sides are on the same page.
Danny, to put that in super plain English and going back to June 20th when the first revelations of this plea agreement, the first details of the contours of it came into view, essentially Hunter Biden's team seemed to think this was the end of the road. They made public statements suggesting that this was the conclusion now of what they believe to be the legal issues against Hunter Biden on a federal level. And even at that time, the Department of Justice, David Weiss, the lead prosecutor here, said this investigation was ongoing. That came to light in a big way in court today when this issue came up, this question came up of does Hunter Biden have immunity for anything, for everything, or simply in this very specific set of circumstances? The answer now appears to be simply for the specific set of circumstances.
Yes, and I don't think the government was being sneaky here, but the reality is sometimes the parties come to court thinking they have an understanding and finding out they don't have an understanding. Was this something that should have been hammered out well in advance and left crystal clear in the minds of both sides? Yes, probably. But there may have been some ambiguous language in either the emails back and forth or a draft plea agreement or whatever the case may be. But they do need to hammer this out. The judge is right. Both sides need to be on the same page, especially as to whether or not this is a true global resolution of all potential charges that could be brought.
Brian, let me go back to you. Can you bring us inside that courtroom with you? As we mentioned, because it is a federal set of charges here, there are no cameras in court, but there's no holding room where they were going in to hash this out, right? I mean, this was happening sort of in plain view, except for during the recesses. Give us a sense of what it was like. Do we expect to see Hunter Biden at any point? Did he speak on his way out?
So just to give you an idea of what it was like inside the courtroom, we were actually in a separate holding area which had a closed-circuit video feed so that we were able to come in and out of the courthouse throughout the process being played out. But we had a bird's-eye view of everything that was happening inside that room. And each and every time the judge took a step back and asked the attorneys to hash things out, we would see them move to different parts of the courtroom and kind of huddle and have discussions. Then we would see them come together, the two sides talking. Then at one point we saw Clark, the attorney for Hunter Biden, take him aside on his own and have what looked to be a very sober conversation about what the next step in this process was. But it seemed as though each time they had thought that they had it all hashed out, the judge would come in and still be very skeptical of their explanations as to what they thought was the path forward. Now, in terms of Hunter Biden himself, we heard from him a great deal throughout the course of this hearing this morning. He was asked very specific questions from the judge directly to him. She talked to him at length about his sobriety, the start date of where he determined his sobriety to be, the last time he had any sort of drug or alcohol intake. She talked about his marriage, his business dealings. She wanted to know the specific names of the companies at the heart of this tax issue. So he was forced to talk quite a bit throughout the course of this hearing. We've not heard from him yet outside of the courtroom yet. So there is always that possibility that he'll make a statement of some kind, although he has been very reluctant to speak to the press at any point throughout this process. So I would still be surprised if something like that were to happen. But yeah, this was, by any measure, this was not a normal hearing. And we saw that play out in real time this morning.
We mentioned this is a legal issue for Hunter Biden. Clearly, Ryan, it is also a political issue for the Biden family, for the president, for the White House. Republicans in Congress have been investigating Hunter Biden, and at the sort of 11th hour overnight, tried to essentially get the judge to put a stop to this plea agreement. Talk us through some of those details and the way that this is playing into your other job, Ryan, covering Capitol Hill here in Washington.
You're absolutely right, Hallie, and I couldn't help but think of the political implications as I was watching this all. You're absolutely right, Hallie, and I couldn't help but think of the political implications as I was watching this all play out. Obviously, when the judge pressed the lead prosecutor, in this case, Leo Wise, as to whether or not the investigation was over, and he made it clear that it was not, that certainly raised my alarm bells in terms of how Republicans could use that information potentially going forward. But the thing that I was most struck by throughout the course of this court proceeding, as it relates to the politics of all of this, is that the biggest contention from Republicans throughout this entire time as it relates to Hunter Biden is that they believe that he's been given preferential treatment. We heard from those IRS whistleblowers last week who believed that the Department of Justice slow-rolled this case, that they ignored hard evidence that they had discovered. And what we saw play out in this courtroom today was anything but. It seemed as though the judge was being even more specific about the details of this plea arrangement. You know, there were multiple times that Hunter Biden's lawyer attempted to try and save this arrangement, tried desperately to try and get this over, even at the very end of the hearing, saying that they want this wrapped up in an expeditious manner. So they did not want this to happen like this. They didn't want this to extend in to more time down the road and potentially the entire thing fall off the rails. And even a worst case scenario for them would be if it were ultimately to go to trial. So this is still a big problem for them. But the political implications back in Washington are enormous. Republicans have seized on any little detail that could potentially be negative or damaging as it relates to Hunter Biden and have amplified that in a major way, specifically trying to tie it to the current President Joe Biden, even though that they haven't really been able to demonstrate concrete evidence to that end. So there is no doubt that the Republican politicians in Washington right now are trying to find a way to seize on this court hearing today as evidence that Hunter Biden has bigger problems. You know, whether or not they will be successful in that aim, and you know whether or not they're going to be able to cut through the nuance of what happened here today. This was a legal proceeding, not a political one.
That's right.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that's how politicians in Washington are going to use it.
Repeated allegations by Republicans that there was some sort of sweetheart deal made, even as the Attorney General has defended his department's actions. I want to bring in our White House correspondent, Mike Memley, who is relocated for the moment to Wilmington, Delaware, where all of this is happening. And Mike, this is an extraordinary split screen at the moment, because at the same time that Hunter Biden, the president's son, was facing these federal charges in court, you had the White House press secretary coming out to brief reporters and addressing this issue in a way and talking about it in a tone that the White House has talked about it before. I want to play a bit of that, and then I want to talk with you about what you're hearing from your sources. Let me play Karine Jean-Pierre.
Now, I know many people have been following the news in Delaware today and we're going to have a lot of questions. And so here's what I'll say at the top before I turn it over to my colleague, the Admiral. Hunter Biden is a private citizen, and this was a personal matter for him. As we have said, the President, the First Lady, they love their son, and they support him as he continues to rebuild his life. This case was handled independently, as all of you know, by the Justice Department under the leadership of a prosecutor appointed by the former president, President Trump. So for anything further, as you know, and we've been very consistent from here, I'd refer you to the Department of Justice and to Hunter's representatives, who is his legal team, obviously, who can address any of your questions.
So, ma'am, you phrased it as the White House, those close to the president, hoping this would be today the beginning of the end. It is clear now that that is not the case.
Yes, and that's clearly going to be a setback for the White House. You had already begun to hear, Hallie, in recent days, a shift in language from the White House. Just yesterday, Karine Jean-Pierre was speaking to sort of the politics of the moment as Republicans on Capitol Hill are ramping up, potentially even an impeachment inquiry into President Biden. As she put it, the president is focused on the American families while Republicans are focused on President Biden's family. The White House has been operating really on two tracks. As it relates to Hunter Biden and his legal exposure here, the White House has emphasized at all turns that there is a firewall, that there is a total independence, whether it's at the Justice Department proper in Washington or among the U.S. Attorney's Office here, which was leading this prosecution, and that the White House had no involvement. The only involvement on the part of the President of the United States was as a loving father who wanted to see his son continue on that road, as that statement from Karine Jean-Pierre indicated, of recovery. His substance abuse problems, very well publicly known at this point, dating back to really 2015 when he lost his brother, the president lost his son, Beau Biden. Biden. But the politics of this, there is a fundamental disconnect on the part of the way these two parties are going to be litigating the 2024 campaign. The White House has always viewed that the legal problems involving the president's son, but also the legal exposure facing the former president, President Biden's likely opponent, are going to be background noise. That really what matters to the American people are the issues that we're going to see President Biden continuing to focus on as he travels, for instance, later this week to Maine, talking about Bidenomics, the economic recovery, talking about what he spoke to from the White House yesterday, efforts his administration is making to try to improve mental health access for the American people. The Biden team remains confident that the voters that are going to decide this election are really focused on those kitchen table issues, but it's very clear that Republicans see value, see a real political value in putting essentially Hunter Biden on the ballot along with his father, and that's why the White House believes at the moment that that will be a strategy that ultimately backfires on Republicans, but they nonetheless had been hoping to use this moment today to move, turn the page essentially, to be able to turn the spotlight much more clearly onto selling the president's accomplishments, and now this legal cloud continuing to hang over the president's son is going to complicate that for sure, Hallie.
Mike Memoli, our White House correspondent there in Wilmington, Delaware, along with our Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles. Our thanks to Chuck Rosenberg and Danny Savalos as well. Again, Hunter Biden entering that not guilty plea, pending potential approval from a judge of a plea agreement negotiated between him and the Department of Justice. Much more to come as this concludes our NBC News special report. Much more ahead on our streaming network, NBC News Now, and of course tonight on NBC Nightly News. I'm Hallie Jackson. Thank you for watching.